We are this morning going to continue to study from the Gospel of Luke. Gospel of Luke, Luke chapter 5. Well, now Jesus is into the actual ministry in chapter 4 and 5, and as his teaching begins to spread, and as his news of his miracles begin to spread, as his reputation grows, as the number of believers increases, what else increases? All that opposition. All that opposition. We were in Luke chapter 5. We had just been talking about that situation when the man who had been lowered through the rooftop of a house because of his own faith and the faith of those men that brought him there. And it happens, as so often does, when Jesus speaks a word, really the healing is accomplished by the time it's spoken. Jesus had told that man to get up, pick up his pallet and go, and immediately what did he do? He got up and picked up and went. The positive response in Luke chapter 5 in verse 26 is generally from the crowd, all the onlookers. And amazement seized them all, and they glorified God and were filled with awe, saying, "We have seen extraordinary things today." Well, not everybody reacted to it that way, did they? It's interesting to compare the way that man was brought to Jesus and the way he departed from Jesus. Really lying there on his pallet. He was been there so long, his body was effectively useless. He was, some would consider, even effectively dead. But how's he leaving? Body fully alive, full of spirit. It's like he's never been sick a day in his life. Well, the crowd is awed, but not the Pharisees. Well, let's just call them ordinary folks, those who were there to really hear Jesus and were even willing to consider what Jesus was teaching and how it might change their lives. They're awed by this. But the Pharisees, they just would not reason the truth, because they've already reasoned the cost of believing in Jesus is just too high. They're not willing to give up their position, their privilege, their standing. I mean, they like it. People are looking to them to hear what they must do. And in order that, if they would do it just as the Pharisees were doing it or claimed to do it, then they would be pleasing to God. They like that power. And so we're finding in this middle section of Luke chapter 5, remembering that Jesus is writing primarily to Gentiles, that he's blending history and theology here. The Gentiles never have known any kind of relationship with God, so it is important to weave these things together in the timeline and both the theological importance of it, weaving it all together, blending the two of them, which would help people to come to this decision, even to see that to believe in Jesus, to trust in God's working in Jesus, is a well-reasoned, logical conclusion. That's really what he's building the case for, isn't it? I understand there's many things by faith that we have to trust, things that are unseen. But the things we need to know in order to trust God and his working in Jesus has, according to John 20, have been more than sufficiently proven and established that those who would believe have every reason to logically determine, this is what I must do. I'll become a follower of Jesus, and by that, be pleasing to God. Again, it does require things. We don't know all the ways that God is working, and even these people at this time, since Jesus has not fully revealed his teaching, not all of it, it does require some trusting in what is yet to come, that kingdom that he's teaching about that's soon coming. But again, there's more than sufficient cause to do so, isn't there? He speaks, and the signs are not just a show. They are, in fact, signs. And there is a message and a reason to believe it. Well, we come to verse 27 in chapter 5. And this is the call of Levi. Verse 27, after this, he went out and saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And leaving everything, he arose and followed him. Who's this Levi? How do you know that? You know it from the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Matthew. Why does he call him Levi here? Because it's the letter written to the Gentiles. That's Aramaic for Matthew's name. That's what Gentiles are speaking. So that's why he goes by that name. He left everything behind. I'm sure he left the money there in the tax office with all the other tax collectors, but he left behind his position. He's leaving behind, shortly leaving behind, this rich, luxurious lifestyle he's led, all of it really by ill-gotten means, extorting more taxes than were due. He's much like the Pharisees in that way. He's got a position of power, and he maintains that position of power by abusing people, by extorting them, by requiring more than is required. But what's he doing after that? Verse 29. And Levi made him a great feast in his house. Talking about Jesus. And there was a large company of tax collectors and others reclining at table with him. And the Pharisees and their scribes grumbled at his disciples, saying, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" What's the attitude of the Pharisees? You know, and not just the Pharisees in this case, with all about tax collectors. I mean, they're the worst of the class of sinners. Yeah, sure, you'd have all these people that are guilty of immorality of all sorts, but man, when you see a group of tax collectors and then with Jesus' disciples, that's just double argument for the Pharisees. I mean, they're lumped together as the worst class. Let me get Hubie first and then you, Jill. Yes, sir, Hubie, what'd you have?
I was just thinking about the hypocrisy here. The Pharisees and they were sitting there eating with them, and they're criticizing Jesus for being there. How do you figure that one?
Well, you know, it's a good point. I've said it so often that when you've begun with your mind already made up about a situation, what are you going to conclude about that situation? What you've already determined. If you begin with the false assumption, what do you wind up with? A false conclusion. And, you know, he's already referred to these Pharisees. They see something and they begin to reason in their hearts, it said. But how do you reason with a heart problem? You're going to wind up with another problem. What'd you have, Jill?
Well, the Pharisees were talking to his disciples.
Yep, that's right.
And so I got to thinking about that. The disciples were not treated, the disciples, weren't fond of tax collectors. They weren't fond of what he was doing, so.
They had all been abused by the same tax collectors.
Right, and so they were talking to his disciples. They're not, so they probably couldn't have answered at that time in their walk. They couldn't have answered correctly.
No, they weren't yet prepared for that.
Because they would have.
It's interesting, though, the point you bring up. If you're going to oppose Jesus, did they come first to Jesus face to face? No, let's go attack his followers. Now, that crazy man Jesus, he can go around and say and do what he wants to do. But what's the enemy's desire?
Yeah, so when Jesus answered, right?
Yeah.
You can look at it two different ways. I mean, he knew what they were thinking or saying or whatever.
Yeah.
He stepped in and didn't let his disciples answer that question. That's just one.
But he's teaching them how
yes,
they will answer that question. And very much, this is how you respond to that. You don't have to go tooth and nail against these men, but as Jesus does, we were just talking about it a bit ago. Ask a question that reasonable minds would stop and consider their own condition. These men just aren't willing to do that. And because they've calculated it's just too great a cost. And so what's Matthew immediately trying to do? He's left his job, but then he's called all his fellow tax collectors over to his house for a big meal. What's he immediately trying to do? Win more followers for Jesus. In that sense, see what has come. See what he's offered me. See what he's called me to do. Maybe you'll come with me. He's inviting, I guess we could call him the IRS, to his house. And those who avail themselves of the invitation, we see it so often through Scripture, even all the way to Revelation. Those who are invited to come to the dinner, those who avail themselves of the invitation, what's in store for them? So much more than they could possibly have if they don't come. It's an opportunity to become followers of Jesus. And again, it is interesting to see these Pharisees just lump Jesus' disciples with the tax collectors as just the worst class of sinners. And it's interesting how he answered the question. I mean, what's the first answer? Verse 34 or 31. He answers this like a physician, I would say even like a cardiologist would answer, a spiritual cardiologist. Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. Why does he call these men who presume themselves to be righteous? These men who boast in their righteousness, why not call them? Because they're not willing to confess that they're sick. I mean, there's no way that they can allow themselves to be sick or in need. And so they're not going to see Jesus. Yes, Mary?
Just because they consider themselves righteous don't mean they are.
But
I mean, they think they are these days.
And what's their standard of righteousness?
Exactly.
Let's just do more and more and more and more, and let's, it's posturing in a false religiosity. That's kind of righteous. Yes, sir?
Yeah, if you go back to chapter 3, verse 12, it's interesting. It says, "And there came also publicans to be baptized. They said unto him, Teacher, what must we do?"
Tax collectors, publicans, yeah.
So, and then a footnote in American Standard says they were talked about. He was mingling.
Mm-hmm.
So they were accusing him of even having contact with these people, but yet these are the ones who were the first to be baptized.
So he's ceremonially unclean because he mingled with them, which is it's amazing. What happens though when when you're reasoning with this kind of heart, that you've already set yourself in opposition to God and what He's doing, that you're just not going to let yourself see the truth. Yes, Tony?
So when Jesus said it's not the healthy who need a doctor, everybody is not everybody is healthy, right? He's talking about in Christ.
Apart from Christ, is anybody healthy?
No. So why, when it says it's not the healthy, is he talking just about the Pharisees that don't think they need help, or?
It would include them, but anybody that doesn't see themselves in need of depending on God. I mean, they may not even yet understand. The disciples don't yet understand fully about Jesus being the Christ. But these men aren't even depending on God, are they? You know, they claim to know God better than anybody, and they claim to obey Him better than anybody. They don't really know Him. And those who presume themselves righteous as they do by all the works and all that they require, they're not depending on God. You're not depending upon Him as if you're posturing yourself as presenting yourself as, you know, you're all that God would ever want somebody to be. It doesn't work that way.
Well, Jesus has just been stacking the unclean on top of the unclean in the Pharisees' eyes, because he touched that leper that had just happened. That leper probably hadn't been touched since he came down with leprosy. You think about the gravity of that, what that meant to that leper. But it didn't matter what the sin was. Jesus was willing to go to them and take that chance of being accused of being unclean. But in the Pharisees' eyes, I think that they thought of tax collectors just as unclean as the leper.
Yeah, because a leper they could just send off out into the wilderness. They can't get away from the tax collector. He's coming after them. And so it's just, you know, again, when we come to the New Testament after 400 years of silence, God's offering to mankind something greater than ever was granted before. Well, we're going to see it in chapter 5. Some people would just prefer to have the same old thing. What do you have, Jim?
Well, I was thinking self-righteousness has been an issue in any age with any person. It's not just the Pharisees.
No, not at all. I mean, we see the type of attitude in them as soon as you're by what you have set to do according to your own standard, by doing that you presume yourself to be the be-all and end-all of somebody that's pleasing to God, you're just proving you're not.
I think that's kind of what part of the example he's given to his disciples.
Yeah. I mean, these disciples, these guys are businessmen. I mean, even the fishermen, they're serious businessmen. These guys are tough. They lived a hard life, a kind of a gritty sort of life. They're used to taking care of themselves. And all of a sudden, they got to say, whoa, it's not me. What you got, Jeff?
Well, I was just wondering, did Levi know anything about Jesus before? I mean, was he at any of his meetings, or did he see any of these miracles in that? Because Jesus just walked up to him and said, follow me, and Levi just dropped it all. I mean, there had to have been something, because he wouldn't have been a tax collector unless he thought things through thoroughly.
Well, he certainly knows of Jesus, because we've already read, you know, one miracle works in this place, and before Jesus gets to the next place, the story is already spread everywhere.
So he's basing his dropping everything, a lucrative business, you know, he's very well off. He's dropping everything, knowing that this man has produced miracles, he's got followers, and I want to be one of them.
And at that moment Jesus calls him, all he's going on is the report of what is said by Jesus.
Right.
It does say something a lot about the person that he's willing to consider. You know, it's not like those others who've just completely closed off.
And maybe too that he is questioning what he's doing too. You know, I mean, I'm sure that he is not pleased with his job. It's lucrative and he's making money, which the Jews always seem to like that, you know. But it could be that he's having second thoughts on what he is actually doing.
Well, he responded. Who responds to Jesus? Those who know they are sick. You've alluded to it. This is a man who thinks things through. He reasons things out. He probably has some very real sense that there's something wrong in his soul. He knows his need. At the moment, he probably can't tell you what it is, but he knows he's sick. There's something just not right. Well, Jesus, by such an answer, you know, I think it is interesting. He goes first, let's take on the disciples before we approach Jesus himself. But his answer, as Jill pointed out, he's really teaching the disciples how to answer, how to reason these things. And then the Pharisees try again. Verse 33. This time they're coming directly at Jesus. Didn't work with his disciples, but now they said to Jesus, the disciples of John fast often and offer prayers, and so do the disciples of the Pharisees, but yours eat and drink. Jesus said to them, again, is he debating law with them? What's he going to? Can you make wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and they will fast in those days. Now he's going to follow it up with a parable, but what's the point here? Isn't it just patently silly that when there's a cause for rejoicing, you're going to put on this long, sad, dour, dark face? What's the biblical purpose for fasting at that time? The commanded day of the fast was that one day a year for the Day of Atonement. And that was a fasting for mourning for sin. You're coming to God through the priest doing all that he is given to do, and you're trusting God for atonement, where you come in that knowing your sorrow for sin. That's that kind of mourning. Well, what did the Pharisees make of it? Well, if one day a year is good, how about let's adding 2 more days every week, every Monday and Thursday. We're going to do this. And that'd be, really good if you're dark and dour and mourning. But Jesus' illustration, that's just silly. When there's no reason for that. When there's time for a celebration. What is it? It's a false kind of piety, isn't it? Now what Jesus is doing here, in the manner of Luke's writing it, he's presenting the difference between truth seekers and religion keepers. Truth seekers, like those tax collectors even, they'll at least listen. But the religion keeper, when it's just pure, just practice of religion, they're not. Well, it is for the Pharisees a chronic sickness, isn't it? That practicing that self-inflated religiosity. I've told some of you about it. I mentioned it to somebody the other day. It reminds me of my dark Lutheran German great-grandfather. He was dark. Everything was dour. You could take a hymn of great rejoicing and it'd sound like a funeral dirge. I mean, that's where they were, and that to him was righteousness. Yeah. Again, that was his version of religion keeping rather than truth seeking. And so in verses 36 and following, Jesus is going to present this parable. No one tears a piece from a new garment and puts it on an old garment. If he does, he will tear the new, and the piece from the new will not match the old. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the new wine will burst the skins, and it will be spilled, and the skins will be destroyed. Something's not working here about mixing the old with the new, is it? Verse 38, but new wine must be put into fresh wineskins. And no one, here's really the point of the parable. And no one after drinking old wine desires new, for he says the old is good. That's the attitude of the Pharisees, isn't it? God has come to offer them something far better than anything there ever was before. But they're content, we just think we like the old stuff. Now, of course, he's not talking about wine. He's talking about covenants. He's talking about a change in God's policy regarding sin. There's a whole new policy regarding sin, the course of action by which a sinner would receive salvation. And rather than seeing themselves in need of that, I think, it's just easier if you like the old wine as far as their old religion, what do they presume? We're already good. What do we need to change? That's why they don't want what's new. It requires change. Well, what happens? Again, it's after 400 years of silence, God's introducing this new covenant. And it's interesting. I was thinking about it. It's as a matter all the way through the Bible. How man's relationship with God has been changing along the way. In the Garden of Eden, yes, God's presence was there. But you get the sense that he's in the area. He's in proximity to man. They can hear him. They fear his coming. He's there, but there's not really a connection. All they know of God is to fear him when they have sinned. Well, what happens in the Mosaic age? There's a kind of a relationship with God. And yes, if they make their sacrifices, then this one high priest one day a year will go into the Holy of Holies. And, well, there's a kind of relationship with God, but it's not directly connected, is it? So now you come into the New Testament, and now you have an immortal priest who is making a way for a direct relationship with God. And so it's whatever it was, but this kind of direct relationship with God also comes with responsibilities and obligations, doesn't it? It's not just about what the high priest is going to do for you once a year. And it's not just about making a sacrifice whenever one need be made. You're still depending on the old system, you're still depending on somebody else doing that for you. Well, the new system is so much better. You can have a direct relationship with God every day, all the time. But the whole point here is about change. And how are these people reacting to the change? Now, change always comes with some difficulty, doesn't it? Always some resistance, but nevertheless, the kingdom of heaven that is coming, in fact, does come. What's the problem with sewing a new patch on old garments? I even talked about trying to patch up my great-great-grandma's old quilt. The old fabric was rotted and wouldn't even hold the new if you tried to sew it on. And it really wasn't going to match, remember?
And then wonder if that new fabric is going to shrink up or draw up differently than what the old fabric has been laundered a whole bunch of times, and so you just can't do that. You can't put those two things together.
And if you put the old to the new, the old is ugly, so is the new. And both are ruined. The same with putting new, in the sense, lively wine, living wine, Jesus' teaching into old wineskins, the Pharisees' practices. What's wrong with their practice, their brand of religion, being old and stiff? It doesn't have any give. It doesn't have any flex. There's no room for expansion. The Pharisees would be very content if they could just be God's kingdom of heaven just themselves. And let's don't worry about anybody else. Let's just keep it us. And so long as we're pleased with our righteousness, it's just about us. Well, that's why they say, I've tasted this new thing, but I just prefer the old. The old's good enough. Yes, sir.
Isn't it a lot to do, not unlike today, that they don't want to relinquish their power. If they follow Christ, they're kind of relinquishing some of their power, and they don't want to do that.
Yeah, not kind of. They are.
They are, yeah.
I mean, anyone that is truly following Christ has relinquished all power. You know, that's why even late in Jesus' ministry, Jesus at times is so frustrated with those disciples. Like, don't you yet get it, guys? Don't you? You know, they're still going, well, if Jesus dies, I'm going to be large and in charge here. Wait a minute. No, you're not. You're true discipleship has no power in themselves. It's that word, according to the Spirit, and doing God's will that is powerful. Yes, Joe?
Well, I think that they were more pleased to follow the traditions of the elders than to accept the doctrines from Jesus. But I think when you think about it, it's pretty much a set course. You know, they did this time, they did this time, and then they did this time. And so you really don't have to think out of the box.
No, there's no self-reflection in it, really. No self-examination.
It's easier. You think about, all the laws they had, but if you know what to expect and you know what you're supposed to be doing, you don't have to think about it. It almost becomes like a automatic kind of no thinking feeling.
And it can happen even with Christians, can it? Jeff and I have talked about this a few times. You can get to where, okay, this is what we do on Sunday. We come, we sing, pray, teach, all that. Check.
Check the box.
And without that real self-examination and really to examine, am I truly submitting to God? Not just, yes, we come to make an offering of our worship. And that we should certainly do. A sacrifice of worship. But is it a religious keeping thing or is it a truth seeking thing? And that's really what Jesus is presenting here. Who is it that would be not only able to see that they are spiritually sick, but willing to confess it? Those who are content to just check? Or those who are really given to receiving the word, giving to submit to it? That's the difference between truth seekers and religion keepers.
Well, God said several places back in the Old Testament, He always wanted His people's hearts. He said, your hearts are far from me. And as He told whenever Saul decided to make that sacrifice against command, he said, sacrifice, because I expect you to keep the commands, do what you're told. And these people got so caught up in their own ability to keep laws that they didn't realize that they really never could keep them perfectly. They always needed God's help, but they wouldn't relinquish control of their heart from the get-go. They never did relinquish, not all of them, but for the most part, they never relinquished their hearts to God fully.
Truth seekers will come to understand their absolute dependence on God. And that's what you're alluding to. These men are not willing to let themselves be seen in that way. That, you mean we can't handle it all ourselves? That we're not large and in charge? There's a long way to go yet in this, but Jesus is right from the start building this case every time. The problem of putting something new into something that is old, and both are ruined. You know, if you're going to trust in the new covenant or in the old covenant and reject the new, you wind up with the benefits of neither, do you? Or if you try to keep both, you wind up with the benefits of neither. If you keep only the new, you receive all that God has promised. Well, change is especially hard because, particularly these men who are convinced they already know God. They boast of it all the time. We know God better than anybody, and we love Him more than anyone. Well, it's an interesting picture. They're satisfied with at that time a 2,000-year-old vintage, 2000 BC, the Mosaic Law, but a fresh drink, they want nothing. What's Jesus building the case here? What is true drink? John chapter 6. What is true drink? What is spiritual drink? Word of Jesus. That belief in Christ Himself. That's true drink. Well, 1 minute. In all of this, in these challenges, first against the disciples, then directly against Jesus, in all of that, they're setting up, the Pharisees are themselves setting up this conflict that comes in chapter 6. And here's how it gets set up. That if you are content with the old, and if those practicing Judaism are content with the old ways of the Pharisees, that's all you're ever going to have. We'll read just the first bit of chapter 6. And on the Sabbath, while He was going through the grain fields, His disciples plucked and ate some heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands. But some of the Pharisees said, "Why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath?" See, if you're content with the same old thing, you're going to wind up with the same old problem. Why do you do what is not lawful? What's wrong with the question? It's not even an honest question, is it? According to whose law? According to whose interpretation of law? That leaves us something to chew on next week. I hope it's good for you to reconsider these things. Certainly we are blessed by what God is now offering to mankind, something far greater than ever granted before.